What are you guys all looking at me for? Hi, I'm Pete and welcome to Just a Few Acres Farm. Here it is in late May and we're facing the same problem we always face in late May. The grass is starting to get ahead of us. What do we do about that? Well, there's a bunch of options that you can do, and which one's best is going to depend on your farm, and I'm going to go through them all in this video, as well as moving the complaining cows to a fresh piece of grass. You guys are going to have to wait a while. We got to get things ready. They got plenty of grass where they're grazing now, but you know, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. Well, we've got all of our stuff in front there and we're headed out to this field. What to do with early season grazing when the grass gets ahead of you is not an easy thing to solve. Hillary and I went over a bunch of options this morning before settling on this one. We got to grab these guys. And here we go, straight down to the wood line. 20 paces and a post. You guys are always trying to rush us along. I don't like it. It's so difficult to work in a toxic workplace like this.
They're just offering us encouragement to get the job done, that's all. Lots of encouragement.
Now we have a line of temporary posts to the wood line all the way over to the winter pasture, which is about 150 yards or so. It's longer than we normally run our strip grazes, but this will work fine. And then it's on with the poly wire. Now we have a temporary fence, 2 reels of Premier 1 poly wire, clipped to the main fence for power, and running all the way down there. Enclosing about 2 acres. All right, you guys, I'll lead you around. Yep, through the gate. Come on, cows. Come on, cows. Oh, you guys know where you're going, don't you? Yeah. Here they all come. Rusty and Peanut. Hi, Peanut. Oh, you're skittish now, huh? I consider 5 major approaches to action when the grass gets ahead of you, and they are in order. Number 1, start daily paddocks. Clamp your pastures way down, move your temporary fences every day. Number 2, keep whole field grazing. Keep them on, for us, usually about 5-acre fields. Absorb the extra trample that they're going to make on over mature grass. Number 3, go to something in the middle, say a weekly paddock, and then gradually bring your paddock size down as the grass continues to get ahead of you. Option 4, use the mow-graze system that we used for quite a few years in the past. And number 5, make haylage or baleage, which is wet hay wrapped to ferment in plastic or put in a bunk or put in a silo. An anaerobic fermentation process takes about a day to dry, and then to bale or chop and blow into the silo or put in a bunk. We chose to go with option 2, which is to clamp down their pasture somewhat. 2 acres, which will be 3 to 4 days of grazing space. And as I said, Hillary and I started out considering all of these options this morning when we were in the house. The only way to know what to do is to come out and look at the fields. So I'm going to show you them. First field, this is the one that they just came off. 5 acres, they were on it for about 5 days. And what you're going to get in grass this tall, up to my knees, is trample. A certain amount of that is a good thing. There's this alarming trend in modern farming to go to zero graze. The big dairies around us are doing some of that, where the cattle never go to the grass. The grass always comes to the cattle, usually in the barn. And I'm not a very big believer in that, to say the least. Trample's important for grass. If you cut it all off, you've lost something. Trample's what replenishes the ground via its breakdown. It's also what insulates the ground. So in the coming dry months of the summer, I want that layer on the soil to hold the moisture in the soil, because that's what keeps the grass growing. And in the end, you could say, well, I lost a percentage of potential food to trample, but you're gaining down the road. It's kind of like money in the bank, because your grass will keep growing when it's drier out. And grazing is an art, not a science, I don't think, as exhibited by the several schools of grazing that you can find from different farmers, all with experience that have gone down different routes. Here's my philosophy. I want the cattle grazing prime growth stage forage, which means I want it to be from about 8 inches tall up to the point where it starts to push seed heads up, because once the forage starts to push seed heads up, the plant starts sending more energy to developing that seed head, and the leaves become less nutritious, less protein rich. So keeping them on that prime stage forage ensures the best nutrition for the cattle. And you may look at this and say, well, why did you pull them off it? There's still a lot here. It's because I saw the trample becoming a little bit more than I would like, and this is the fastest growing field I have. So by pulling them off of it now, when good haymaking weather comes, hopefully in a couple weeks, everything will be ready to hay, and this field will be in prime shape to do that. So I'll have grazed it once and then made hay off of it after about a 2-week rest. And the grazing that we did on this field early on will actually encourage grass growth and give me even a denser, thicker hay crop. This is the field they were on first thing when we first turned them out, and it's had about a 2-week rest since then. And you can see in this field that the clovers come back nicely. It doesn't take long in this kind of weather for us to get big new clover leaves again. This field as well, I'm dropping off the rotation probably, and I'm going to save for hay, with a caveat that I don't know the weather, and we may have to go to cut grazing, which I'll explain later. All right then, back in with the cattle. You see, the whole problem with our climate is that dang weather. It's too cool and it's too wet when the grass heads out in late May, early June to make dry hay. And the whole trick is getting around that. If I lived in a warmer climate, I could cut hay and always keep it in that prime growth stage, 8 inches to pushing up seed head, that zone right there. That's also when the grass is growing fastest. You're coming to see me. How are you doing, bud? You remember me. Yeah. You always like chin scratches. Oh. A chin scratch. There you go. So to get around my little climate problem, me and the farmers around me have those 5 options to go to that I talked about a few minutes ago. And I'll go through them one by one now and give you the pros and cons of each. Option number 1 is to continue whole field grazing just like we were doing up until now. So for our herd size, keeping them on about 5 acres, keeping them on each field no more than a week, because you want to keep them moving so that some of the trample that they leave behind will come back up and they just won't wind up trampling the whole mass of vegetation onto the ground with repeated foot traffic. So keep them moving, keep them on big fields. The advantages to that are you can not spend so much labor. You're just moving them from one field to the next every so often. The big disadvantage is that no matter how well you do it, you're going to go beyond that peak growth stage forage and you're going to have them grazing in grass that's up to their back by the time you get around to haying it, because the grass grows so fast this time of year. So we don't usually do that when the grass is in this stage anyway. Option number 2 is to progressively clamp down on your grazing area, and that's the option we chose because we have grass that matches the right conditions for grazing right now. So instead of grazing 5 acres, now we're grazing about 2 acres. They'll run through this in about 2 days and we'll move them on to the next field. The advantage to this is, again, there's less work. You're not moving every day yet. The disadvantage is that they're gonna go through more and take the most tender stuff that they want out, which is always the clover. That's the best tasting stuff to them, but it's something you can live with during prime growth period because it comes back so fast in this weather. Option number 3 is to go directly to a daily grazing paddock and move them every day. Lots of advantages, some disadvantages. The main advantage is you're not having them go over the ground more than a day's worth of time, so they're not eating everything down so much. And if your grass was taller than this, the advantage is that you can get them to work over some of that less desirable stuff, some of the stuff that's already starting to push up seed heads before they move on, and have a more kind of even takedown of your pasture and keep them from trampling too much as they move day to day. For our size herd, which is about 30 head or so, soon to be more, calves are on the way in a few weeks, this method isn't really warranted at that stage in the season. It's a lot of labor for what you get out of it versus just slowly clamping down paddocks and then really tightening them up when forage growth slows down in the summertime. The 4th option is one that I honestly thought we were going to wind up doing today until we took a look at the grass. And that's what I call cut graze. It's based off of a British system, or maybe it's an Irish system, I can't remember, called cut wilt graze, where you actually mow ahead of the cows on a daily or twice daily basis, and then they graze up the already cut grass. And it has some advantages and some drawbacks, just like any other method. We did this for a few years and it worked well for us. The advantages to it is the cattle will clean up everything that's cut. So you move your fence over a day, in our case with a small herd once a day, you cut what they're going to eat for the day, and we cut it through a haybine instead of a sickle bar mower because the haybine will leave a fluffy windrow and the cows are more likely to scoop that up than what a sickle bar does, which is kind of lay the grass flat on the ground. It was very efficient as far as getting the forage into the cattle, and it's a good way to deal with over mature forage because the cattle won't pass over those more mature plants because they're mixed in with everything else. They just scoop it all up and shove it down the hatch. The main disadvantage to it is that it stalls the grass. So remember I talked about keeping the grass in prime growth zone 8 inches to when it's pushing up a seed head. If you go and cut it, and my haybine's cutting, I don't know, about 3 inches tall, that grass is going to stall for a while as the plant has to pick up momentum again to start growing. So overall you're going to harvest less vegetative matter off of your fields in a summer if you do the cut graze method. But as the grass gets further ahead of us, it's a good way to save your stockpile and measure out your stockpile, because when the grass gets way ahead of you and you go to, if you just go to daily grazing without mowing first, you're going to wind up with a lot trampled and left behind, even though you're trying to clamp down so they'll eat as much as possible. In our experience, that hasn't worked ideally, and that's when we've had to go to the cut graze method. And so if you've got a field ahead of you that's full of over mature forage and you start metering it out by cutting a certain amount every day, you're going to be going through less of that forage than if the cattle are going through and trampling a significant percentage of it on a daily mob grazing plot without mowing. The fifth and last option is making haylage or baleage. Haylage is you cut the grass and you let it wilt and dry for about a day if the weather's decent, and then you chop it, you run it through a chopper into a wagon, and then you haul the wagon and you either put it in a bunk, which is a kind of on-ground silo, concrete sides covered with plastic, or you put it in a traditional silo. The wetter grass ferments in that and makes just a delicious mixture for the cattle. You can also make baleage, which is quite popular around here, where you follow the same process, but instead of chopping it and putting it in a silo, you run it through a baler and make a round bale, and then you wrap the round bales in plastic. You can either wrap them singularly, they look like giant white marshmallows, or you can wrap them in a tube, one after the other, and you'll see these tubes when you drive out in the country. Again, excellent nutritional value for cattle. Not an option for me because we lack the infrastructure. In order for me to do that, I would have to buy another baler to handle those heavier bales. I would have to buy a bale wrapper, which is what I saw recently at auction, a $10,000 to $12,000 investment for a good one. I would have to buy the plastic. If I chose to chop it and make it into true haylage, I would have to have a storage mechanism, either a silo or a bunk. That's a major investment. I'd have to buy a chopper. I'd have to buy a silage wagon to put it in. I'd have all kinds of expenditures, which you can't justify with a herd this small. So that option's always been off the table with me. The dairy farmers around here are cutting for haylage now, because they can always catch it in prime growth mode because they have that option. Not the least of which, the disadvantage to me is the plastic use. If you're not blowing into a silo, you got to cover either a bunk with plastic, which often is reusable, so that's not as bad. But at my scale, I'd be more toward doing baleage, where I've got to wrap the bales with plastic. There is no mechanism for recycling that plastic. Cornell used to have a program, but the problem with the plastic is you can't keep it clean. Inevitably, it comes back to them with dirt on it or hay residue, just stuff that's stuck to it, and it can't be recycled, so it turns out being a waste. And that's just too much for my conscience to be sending all that plastic to the landfill after just one use. So this is the trick to grazing. This is why it's an art. This is why it's situational, why you don't go into it with a plan. And it's also why we don't build permanent paddocks, you know, cross fences all along our fields, because conditions are always changing and that paddock size is not going to work most of the time. The other reason we don't do it is because we take hay off of those same fields, and you don't want to make hay off of a whole bunch of little rectangles. You want to be able to, for less waste reason, hay the whole field. This may seem overwhelming if you're just starting out grazing, but the good news is the more you get experience with it, the kind of higher level you can bring it to. Your cows aren't going to starve if you put them on over mature grass. It's just a matter of making the best beef out of that grass that you can and starting to observe the finer details as you get experience. Now, the next challenge after you finish dealing with the overabundance you have this time of year is the sudden stall that happens in the summer in our climate. All of a sudden, usually, rain dries up, it's gone, it gets really hot, and the grass just stalls. So at that point, you have to make sure that you've left enough stockpile after your first cutting to get you through the lean time. So then there's always the question that comes, how much hay should I cut when I cut the hay to make sure I've left enough to get through that summer? And that's a real gamble because you don't know if it's going to continue to rain for a while and it'll come back. You just can't tell. So it's a gamble we take every year, and sometimes we have to resort to feeding hay because I took a little bit too much on the first cutting, and sometimes the grass continues to be beyond us. Farming is an art, you know, and this kind of stuff is what keeps it interesting. for me and for other farmers. And if you're getting into farming, I hope this video was helpful. Grazing season is always a challenge. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.